Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into one of the most, tumultuous decades in American history, the 1850s. And just to kick us off, picture this. May 1856, the floor of the United States Senate. Not exactly a place for polite debate that day, because a South Carolina congressman, Preston Brooks, was literally beating Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner with a cane. Brutally. And this wasn't some, backroom brawl. It was an open, public act of violence, really fueled by these fierce, escalating debates over slavery.
It's an incredibly potent image, isn't it? Just a raw physical display of the deep, violent divisions that were, tearing the nation apart. And our mission in this deep dive is basically to unpack that whole decade, the 1850s. It was a period where sectional controversy between North and South just ramped up incredibly fast. We'll explore how a series of events, legislative moves, court decisions, things that might have seemed isolated, actually just rapidly intensified the antagonism. It pushed the United States from this uneasy compromise right to the absolute brink of civil war.
Yeah, and our source material for this deep dive is a detailed historical account. It's really rich with specific events, key figures, and crucially, the different perspectives that fueled all the conflict back then. So we're going to try and cut through that complexity, pull out the most important insights, and help you understand the why and the how behind this traumatic unraveling of American democracy. We'll pinpoint those critical turning points, maybe some surprising facts, too, that show exactly how the nation reached its breaking point.
Okay, so let's start right there with that shocking incident, the caning of Sumner, because it's a perfect illustration of the powder keg really igniting. It happened in May 1856, right after a speech Sumner gave just 2 days before.
That caning of Sumner, it's just such a startling picture. What exactly did Sumner say in that speech that was so inflammatory? I mean, enough to provoke such a violent personal attack, not just, political disagreement.
Well, Sumner's speech was called The Crime Against Kansas. And in it, he just went all out condemning slavery. He called admitting Kansas as a slave state the rape of a virgin territory.
Wow.
But he didn't stop there. He got personal. He specifically attacked another senator, Andrew Butler of South Carolina, who just happened to be Preston Brooks's relative. And Sumner really twisted the knife. He insulted Butler, comparing his devotion to slavery to, prostitution. He said Butler had chosen a mistress. The harlot slavery. Pretty strong stuff.
Yeah, harlot slavery. Okay, so Brooks's response, beating Sumner senseless with a cane. What did that symbolize to people at the time, especially in the South?
And here's where it gets really interesting. Brooks's attack, it was actually celebrated by a lot of Southerners. Seriously. They saw it as this sort of manly defense of gentlemanly honor and, by extension, their whole way of life. It just starkly symbolized how personal, how visceral these political debates had become. It showed this violent clash between the pro and anti-slavery sides. The whole idea of compromise was just evaporating.
And what does that level of personal hatred tell us about the stakes? I mean, what they felt was really on the line. This wasn't just a one-off, right? It seems like it illustrates this growing contempt between the extremes that really defined the whole decade.
Absolutely. It shows the political had become intensely personal. There was no separating them. But, before this explosion, there were these desperate attempts to find some kind of truce. The most famous one, of course, is the Compromise of 1850. All the big issues that Congress was wrestling with in 1850, they all stemmed from that huge chunk of Western land the U.S. got from the Mexican-American War, the Mexican Secession. And the central burning question was always, would these new states be slave states or free soil states?
And it seems like the Wilmot Proviso, which came up way back in 1846, even though it never actually became law, it kind of drew the battle lines, didn't it? Why was that proposal so significant?
Because it just laid bare the fundamental incompatibility, The northern and southern visions for what America's future territories should look like were just totally different. The proviso called for slavery not to expand into any of those new territories, period. And the Free Soil Party, which basically grew out of this whole debate, made that its main platform. Now, it's crucial to understand, they weren't abolitionists trying to end slavery everywhere right then. Their goal was mostly to keep the West free for white laborers so they wouldn't have to compete with enslaved labor. That's different from the abolitionists who wanted slavery gone everywhere.
Okay, so besides the expansion question, what other issues were kind of simmering and making things tense in Congress around that?
Well, there was definitely pressure, especially from the North, to end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. itself. Not slavery, mind you, but the buying and selling of people in the nation's capital. Southerners, on the other hand, they wanted much stronger federal laws about fugitive slaves. Then you also had this messy border dispute between Texas and New Mexico, and California was pushing hard for statehood because of the gold rush, and California looked set to come in as a free state, partly because Mexico had already banned slavery there. That really upset the balance Southerners wanted to maintain.
Right. So as these tensions were mounting, who were the main players trying to sort all this out? What were their strategies for compromise?
Well, a key figure was President Zachary Taylor. Now, he was a slaveholder himself, interestingly, but his top priority was preserving the Union. He actually made Southerners pretty angry by calling for both California and New Mexico to be admitted as free states. He even suggested applying the Wilmot Proviso idea to the whole Mexican cession. And then, of course, you had Henry Clay, the famous great compromiser. He put forward a whole package of resolutions. California comes in free. But no restrictions on slavery in the rest of the territory gained from Mexico, so rejecting the Wilmot Proviso there. He also sided with New Mexico on the border with Texas, suggested the government pay off Texas's debts, and proposed ending the slave trade in D.C. He tried to bundle all this together initially as one big omnibus bill.
Okay, an omnibus bill. And how did that go over in Congress? I'm guessing it wasn't exactly a smooth ride.
Oh, far from it. It kicked off 8 straight months of really spirited and angry debate, as our source puts it. You had John C. Calhoun, the sort of elder statesman of the pro-slavery side, blaming the North for trying to limit slavery's expansion. He demanded a really tough federal fugitive slave law. He even hinted at disunion, floating this radical idea of a dual presidency. One president for the North, one for the South.
Wow, a dual presidency.
Yeah. Encountering Calhoun was Daniel Webster, the senator from Massachusetts. He gave his famous 7th of March speech calling for national unity. Famously said he spoke not as a Massachusetts man, but as an American. But interestingly, he also called for a new federal fugitive slave law, which actually cost him a lot of support among abolitionists back home. Then there was William H. Seward, another influential senator, a Whig. He really positioned himself as an abolition advocate, said slavery was just incompatible with all men are created equal, and talked about a higher moral law than the Constitution.
And it sounds like these debates weren't just verbal sparring matches. The sources mentioned they sometimes devolved into fistfights or worse. There was that one incident, April 1850, where Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who actually criticized slavery even though he enslaved people, almost attacked Mississippi Senator Henry Foote.
Yeah.
And Foote apparently drew his pistol right there on the Senate floor.
Can you imagine?
It's hard to picture that today, isn't it? What is that level of personal animosity, that willingness to resort to violence? Tell us about how high they felt the stakes were.
It tells you the stakes felt existential, like the whole future of the country was hanging by a thread. The breakthrough, such as it was, came after President Taylor suddenly died. The story goes it was from eating too many cherries and iced milk on a hot day. So his vice president, Millard Fillmore, took over. And unlike Taylor, Fillmore was actually willing to work with Congress to find some kind of solution. Then Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois, remember that name? He pops up again. He took over managing the compromise efforts from a pretty frustrated Henry Clay. Douglas had this clever idea. Break Clay's big omnibus bill into 5 separate pieces of legislation. And that strategy worked. They passed collectively as the Compromise of 1850.
Okay, so let's break down those 5 bills. What were the key parts, the gives and takes for each side?
Right. So number 1, a big win for the South. Congress passed that much tougher Fugitive Slave Act. It even offered federal money, basically bounties, to people who caught escaped slaves. Second, balancing that out, California was admitted as a free state. That definitely cheered the North. Third, on the Texas-New Mexico border, New Mexico got the better deal, which pleased the North, and the federal government agreed to pay off Texas's debts as part of that. Fourth, the slave trade, again, just the trade, was banned in Washington, D.C. The North welcomed that, but slavery itself was still legal there. And finally, number 5, on the really tricky question of slavery in the new territories, Congress kind of punted. They applied the principle of popular sovereignty. Basically, let the people living there decide for themselves whether to allow slavery or not.
Okay, popular sovereignty. So what was the immediate feeling after all this passed? Did people think, okay, crisis averted, we fixed it?
Well, not exactly fixed it. There was definitely a widespread feeling of relief across the country. Most Americans thought, phew, the Union's been saved. But really, it was more like a fragile truce than a real resolution. If you look at the votes, they split almost perfectly along north-south lines. That shows you just how deep those sectional divisions already were. You still had Southern extremists, the fire eaters, calling for secession, though they were a minority then. But most Southerners basically decided they'd stay in the Union only if slavery was protected where it existed and if it could potentially expand into new territories through this popular sovereignty idea. I was like, okay, we'll stay, but on these conditions. It was definitely a temporary patch-up job.
And that temporary calm, as you called it, proved really short-lived, didn't it? Especially that Fugitive Slave Act. It seems like instead of being part of a compromise, it actually just fueled the fire more. Why was that specific act so provocative?
It really was a moral powder keg. The act didn't just allow slave catching, it basically mandated Northern complicity. It imposed heavy fines, even prison time, on anyone in the North or Midwest who helped escape slaves or even just refused to join a posse to hunt them down. It set up these federal commissioners who actually got paid more if they ruled someone was a slave, $10, versus if they declared them free, $5. Talk about an incentive.
Yeah, that sounds biased.
Totally. And there were no juries. The accused runaway couldn't even testify for themselves. And critically, free Black people living in the North were constantly in danger of being kidnapped and sent south under this law. So it wasn't just some abstract legal thing. It forced ordinary Northern citizens into potentially becoming slave catchers themselves. It turned distant arguments into really immediate personal moral crises.
You can imagine the outrage that would cause. How did people in the North react to basically feeling like they were being forced into this role?
Well, for many Northerners, it absolutely confirmed their fears about a slave power conspiracy. This idea that a small group of elite Southern slaveholders had way too much influence over the federal government. It was ironic, too, because Southerners always talked about states' rights. But here they were demanding strong federal power to enforce slavery in the North. And this led to massive resistance. The Underground Railroad, that network of safe houses and guides run by Northern whites and free Blacks, became even more vital. Historians estimate maybe 50,000 to 100,000 people escaped using it. Quakers were very active in it. For lots of freedom seekers, the only real safety was getting all the way to Canada, specifically Southern Ontario, where slavery had been abolished.
And speaking of the Underground Railroad, you had to mention Harriet Tubman. What made her such a standout, legendary figure during this time?
Oh, her courage was just unbelievable. She had escaped slavery herself, but she went back south, reportedly over a dozen times, risking her life again and again. She's credited with leading more than 300 people to freedom. Sarah Bradford's biography famously called her Moses because she led her people out of bondage. Just an incredible story.
And cases like Anthony Burns's really brought the whole issue home for people in a visceral way, didn't they?
Absolutely. Burns was arrested as a fugitive slave in Boston in 1854, and it caused huge demonstrations, basically riots. President Franklin Pierce actually sent in federal troops to make sure Burns was returned to Virginia. That just fueled Northern anger about this perceived conspiracy of Southern power. Eventually, abolitionists in Boston did manage to buy his freedom, but the symbolism of federal troops enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act in Boston was powerful.
And then, of course, there's Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, published in 1852. It wasn't just a book, it was a cultural earthquake. What kind of impact did it have?
Oh, enormous. It was a runaway bestseller, apparently the most read novel of the entire 19th century. Stowe used stories she'd heard, some first-hand accounts, to paint this picture of slavery as a terrible sin. Something that destroyed families, Black and white, and corrupted everyone involved, like the infamous character Simon Legree. It had this huge emotional impact. It was translated into something like 60 languages. It's still in print today. And it also showed the power of women through moral persuasion and literature to really shape public opinion on a massive scale. It humanized the victims of slavery for millions who'd never witnessed it directly.
So the North wasn't just, reading books and protesting. Some states actually passed laws, these personal liberty laws. What were they trying to do with those?
Right. 8 northern state legislatures passed these laws. They were basically designed to counteract the Fugitive Slave Act at the state level. They tried to guarantee legal protections for people arrested as fugitives, things like the right to a jury trial, which the federal law denied. It was a clear case of the North using a states' rights argument against federal power, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? And of course, this infuriated Southerners. They saw it as the North nullifying federal law and spitting on the Compromise of 1850.
Okay, so this brief calm, if you can even call it that, really shattered in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What prompted this new legislation, and what was the really explosive part of it?
Well, there was increasing pressure from the North, especially farmers and railroad boosters, to organize the territory west of Missouri and Iowa. They wanted farms, they wanted a route for a transcontinental railroad, but Southerners were still really resentful of that old Missouri Compromise line from 1820, the 36-degree, 30 minutes parallel that banned slavery in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase. They insisted that popular sovereignty should apply to all new territories. So Stephen Douglas, remember him from the Compromise of 1850? He thought he had a clever solution. He introduced a bill to organize two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. He proposed using popular sovereignty for both. But here's the explosive part. His bill explicitly repealed the Missouri Compromise line. Douglas probably hoped this would appease the South, unite the Democrats, maybe boost his own presidential chances, and, not coincidentally, potentially get that railroad terminus built in his home state in Chicago.
Repealing the Missouri Compromise line. Wow. Okay. What were the political shockwaves from that? It sounds like it would just blow up the existing political landscape.
It absolutely did. It was a political earthquake. The bill barely passed Congress, and it completely fractured the Democratic Party along North-South lines. But the most significant consequence, it led directly to the creation of the Republican Party. This was a brand new political party. It pulled together Northern Whigs, whose party was collapsing, anti-slavery Democrats who hated the Kansas-Nebraska Act, former Free Soilers and abolitionists. The old Free Soil Party basically vanished. The Republicans had one core pledge: stop the spread of slavery into the territories. They constantly railed against the slave power. And because their support was entirely in the North, they instantly became a purely sectional party, polarizing the whole U.S. political system like never before. It was a massive shift.
And applying popular sovereignty to Kansas itself led to immediate violence and chaos, earning it that grim nickname, Bleeding Kansas, around 1855, 1856. How did this idea of letting the settlers decide actually play out on the ground?
Yeah, popular sovereignty sounds democratic, but in Kansas, it was anything but. Both pro- and anti-slavery activists just flooded into the territory trying to influence the vote. You had these border ruffians, basically pro-slavery guys from neighboring Missouri who crossed over, often illegally, to vote in Kansas elections. Estimates suggest maybe 60% of the votes in some early elections were fraudulent. They managed to elect a pro-slavery territorial legislature, which then drafted a pro-slavery constitution, the Lecompton Constitution. But the actual majority of settlers in Kansas were free soilers, many migrating from New England, sometimes even funded by groups like the New England Emigrant Aid Society, and they were furious, just seething, as the source says, at how the democratic process was being hijacked by these border ruffians. So clashes were inevitable.
And this escalated to the sacking of Lawrence in May 1856. What exactly happened there? What did it represent?
Right. A large group, basically a pro-slavery posse led by a Sheriff Samuel Jones, rode into Lawrence, which is the main anti-slavery town in Kansas. Now, the townspeople had decided on a policy of non-resistance, but the posse went on a rampage anyway. They smashed the presses of two anti-slavery newspapers, the Herald of Freedom and the Kansas Free State. Then they burned down the Free State Hotel. They were carrying banners with slogans like Southern rights and even the superiority of the white race. It wasn't just about property destruction. It was a very clear, violent message aimed at crushing the anti-slavery movement there.
And this is where John Brown enters the Kansas story in a major way. What was his reaction to the events in Lawrence?
Well, he was described as a strict, God-fearing Calvinist and staunch abolitionist. He genuinely believed, according to our source, that God had raised him up on purpose to break the jaws of the wicked. When he heard about the sacking of Lawrence, and especially that the anti-slavery folks hadn't fought back, he was apparently disgusted. So he took matters into his own hands. He led a small group, including his sons, to a settlement along Pottawatomie Creek. And there, they dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers out of their cabins and brutally executed them with swords. It's important to note, none of these victims actually owned slaves or were involved in the Lawrence raid. It was just brutal, targeted retribution.
Executed them with swords.
Wow. And what were the consequences of Brown's actions at Pottawatomie Creek? Brown's raids set off a whole new, vicious cycle of guerrilla warfare in Kansas. More attacks, more reprisals. It led to over 150 deaths and a lot of property destruction over the next few months. Kansas truly earned the name Bleeding Kansas. And this was a real turning point for some abolitionists. Up until then, many followed pacifists like William Lloyd Garrison. But after Pottawatomie, some started to think maybe violence is necessary to fight slavery. And as we sort of bookended this, the violence in Kansas, including Brown's actions, directly contributed to the charged atmosphere that led to the caning of Charles Sumner back in Washington. It brings us full circle, showing how interconnected all these events were becoming.
Okay, so the situation is just getting worse and worse.
Yeah.
Then comes the Dred Scott decision from the Supreme Court in 1857. This seems like another major blow, deepening the crisis even more. Can you break down this really landmark ruling? What was the case about, and what were its huge implications?
Yeah, Dred Scott was a huge one. The case involved Dred Scott, who was an enslaved man. He had lived with his owner for several years in Illinois, a free state, and also in the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was banned by the Old Northwest Ordinance. So he sued for his freedom, arguing that living on free soil had made him legally free. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, ruled against Scott. He remained enslaved. But Taney and the majority didn't stop there. They made two incredibly sweeping pronouncements that went far beyond Scott's individual case. First, they declared that black people, whether they were enslaved or legally free, could never be considered citizens of the United States.
Never citizens.
Yeah, never citizens. And second, they ruled that Congress had no constitutional authority to prohibit or limit the spread of slavery into any American territories. This second point explicitly declared the Missouri Compromise, which Congress had already repealed, but the court now said was unconstitutional from the start, and it also implicitly destroyed the whole idea of popular sovereignty. If Congress couldn't ban slavery in a territory, how could a territorial legislature, which gets its power from Congress, do it?
Right. So if you're a Republican whose whole platform is basically built on stopping the spread of slavery, or even if you're a Northern Democrat like Stephen Douglas who championed popular sovereignty, how does this decision hit you?
Oh, Republicans were absolutely infuriated. It felt like the ultimate proof of that slave power conspiracy they were always talking about. Now, it seemed even the Supreme Court was under Southern control. The ruling basically declared the central plank of their party platform unconstitutional, and it put Northern Democrats, especially Stephen Douglas, in a really tough spot. His signature idea, popular sovereignty, had just been torpedoed by the highest court in the land. It essentially told the North that their main political tool for limiting slavery's expansion was illegitimate.
So all this chaos bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott ruling, really sets the stage for that famous Illinois Senate race in 1858 between Stephen Douglas, the incumbent, and this relatively unknown lawyer, Abraham Lincoln. Why were their debates so important, and how did they kind of crystallize the national argument?
Those 7 debates were a huge deal, mainly because they were widely reported across the country. Lincoln, who wasn't really a national figure before this, suddenly got massive exposure. Douglas, for his part, tried to paint Lincoln and the Republicans as radical abolitionists. He accused them of wanting racial equality, even miscegenation, race mixing, which was a really potent scare tactic at the time. He kept calling them black Republicans and claimed they were a dangerous threat to the Constitution and wanted to break up the Union.
And Lincoln's response, he gave that famous House divided speech earlier. How did he articulate the core problem facing the country during the debates?
Lincoln famously argued, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." He insisted the nation would eventually become all one thing or all the other. He framed the Dred Scott decision and the Kansas-Nebraska Act not just as isolated events, but as part of a coordinated effort to actually nationalize slavery, to make it legal everywhere. Now, it's really important to understand the nuance in Lincoln's position on equality, especially back then. He did say he had no purpose to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. He even acknowledged what he called a physical difference between the races that would probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. But, and this is a crucial but, he strongly asserted that black people were included in the Declaration of Independence as promised. He said they were entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he added they were his equal and yours in the right to eat the bread, which his own hand earns. So he was walking this very fine line. Stop slavery's spread, uphold the Declaration's core human rights principles, but don't directly attack slavery where it was already established.
Okay, that's a really important distinction. So how did Douglas counter Lincoln, especially after the Dred Scott ruling seemed to undercut his popular sovereignty idea?
Douglas had to do some fancy footwork. His response came during the second debate in Freeport, Illinois, and it became known as the Freeport Doctrine. He basically doubled down on popular sovereignty. He argued that, okay, maybe the Supreme Court said slavery could go into territories, Dred Scott, but he insisted the people living in a territory could still effectively exclude it just by not passing local laws, police regulations, slave codes needed to protect slave property. He said the people have the lawful means to introduce it or exclude it as they please, regardless of the court's ruling. Now, this clever argument might have helped him win the Senate election in Illinois that year, but it absolutely enraged Southerners. They felt he was betraying the Dred Scott decision and finding a backdoor way to block slavery. It drove an even deeper wedge into the Democratic Party.
It just seems like every attempt to find middle ground just made things worse. And then just when you think the tension can't get any higher, October 1859. John Brown is back. This time, he leads this raid on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. What was he trying to achieve there, and how did it turn out?
Yeah, John Brown, the same man from Pottawatomie Creek. This time, with about 18 followers, both black and white, he attacked the U.S. arsenal at Harpers Ferry. His plan apparently was to seize all the weapons stored there, distribute them to enslaved people in the area, and spark this massive slave uprising that would spread across the South and destroy slavery by force. He'd completely given up on nonviolent methods. But the raid was, frankly, a total failure. It was poorly planned. There weren't actually that many enslaved people living right near Harpers Ferry to rally to his cause. His small force was quickly surrounded and captured by U.S. Marines who happened to be commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee. Brown himself was wounded, captured, tried for treason against Virginia, convicted, and hanged on December 2nd, 1859.
A complete failure militarily. But what about the reactions to the raid? How do people in the North and South see John Brown and his actions?
The reactions were just night and day, utterly polarizing. In the South, there was absolute fury and terror. Brown was seen as a dangerous terrorist, proof that the North, or at least radical abolitionists, wanted to incite slave rebellions and destroy their entire civilization. Support for secession, which had been simmering, really started to boil over. There was this widespread fear that a hostile Northern majority, maybe even a future Republican president, would stop at nothing to destroy slavery. In the North, however, the reaction was much more complex. While many condemned his violence, a significant number of anti-slavery Northerners hailed Brown as a hero, a martyr for the cause of liberty. Some even compared him to Jesus Christ. He became this potent symbol, either a terrifying fanatic or a righteous warrior, depending entirely on where you stood.
Okay, so we've had Bleeding Kansas, Dred Scott, the Lincoln-Douglas debates revealing these deep divisions, John Brown's raid sparking a terror and martyrdom. All of this really seems to be pointing towards the election of 1860 as the breaking point. Was secession basically inevitable by then, or were there any paths left to avoid it?
By 1860, those paths were incredibly narrow, maybe non-existent. The Democratic Party, which had been the last real national party, was just completely shattered. The Dred Scott decision, Douglas's Freeport Doctrine, and then John Brown's raid had just ripped it apart along sectional lines. Southern Democrats, especially the hardline fire eaters, were determined not to let a Northern Democrat like Stephen Douglas, who they felt betrayed them with the Freeport Doctrine, get the presidential nomination. So when the Democrats held their nominating convention in Charleston, South Carolina, it just broke up in chaos. They couldn't agree. Eventually, the Northern Democrats nominated Douglas anyway. The Southern Democrats walked out and nominated their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, on a platform explicitly protecting slavery in the territories. And then, to confuse things even more, some former Whigs and moderates formed the Constitutional Union Party. They nominated John Bell of Tennessee, and their platform was basically just ignore the slavery issue, preserve the Union, and uphold the Constitution. No real plan.
So, a totally fractured opposition. And the Republicans united in the North. They nominated Abraham Lincoln. What was the result of this four-way race, and what was the immediate Southern reaction?
Lincoln won the presidency. But it's crucial to understand how he won. He got less than 40% of the total popular vote nationwide. In fact, his name wasn't even allowed on the ballot in many Southern states. However, because he swept almost all the free states, which had more electoral votes, he won a clear majority in the Electoral College. For the Southern fire eaters and many others in the South, Lincoln's election, even though he promised not to touch slavery where it existed, was the absolute last straw. They saw a purely sectional, anti-slavery party taking control of the federal government. They refused to accept the results. South Carolina took the lead, calling a convention and formally voting to secede from the United States in December 1860. You mentioned Mary Boykin Chestnut, the South Carolina diarist. She wrote something like, "With Lincoln elected, the black radical Republicans have the power. I suppose they will brown us all." That captures the intense fear in the South, fear of abolition, fear of slave revolts like Brown tried to start, fear of losing their entire way of life. Lincoln's election was the trigger. It set off the chain reaction of secession, state by state leaving the Union, ultimately leading to the collapse of the American democratic experiment and the outbreak of the Civil War.
So looking back at this whole tumultuous decade, what's the big takeaway for you? It seems like every attempt to compromise 1850 Kansas-Nebraska, instead of fixing things, just made the underlying conflict over slavery worse, pushing the nation faster towards crisis.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Each supposed solution seemed to create new problems, new resentments, new levels of distrust. It really highlights how trying to compromise on a fundamental moral and economic conflict like slavery, without actually resolving it, can be incredibly volatile and just accelerate the breakdown. The compromises were like putting duct tape on a bursting dam.
And maybe a final provocative thought for our listeners. Think about how those core American values, words like liberty and property, were being interpreted in such radically different ways by the North and South, pulling the nation apart. Could things have turned out differently? Could they have found a genuine consensus on slavery's future back then? Or, given how deeply entrenched the economic, ideological, and frankly moral positions were, was a violent conflict like the Civil War almost an inevitable result of the 1850s? What does this whole decade teach us about the real long-term costs when you try to compromise on foundational issues without achieving true resolution? Something to think about.